Hello and welcome back to my channel. My name is Janai and this is Karmic Fixer Tarot. And tonight we are continuing our Jungian deck study, the Jungian Tarot by Robert Wang. And I'm drawing from the source materials, the companion books of the deck, Tarot Psychology, and the Jungian Tarot and its archetypal imagery, both by Robert Wang. Now, not a requirement per se for this deck, but it really helps me to understand the deck. And tonight we're continuing with our Tower card. And this is a very fascinating card. If you're familiar at all with the Rider-Waite-Smith or any other tarot deck, you've probably already noticed a few significant differences. So we can take in the card for just a moment, and of course I'll do cutaways to hopefully make it easier to see. So we've got the fiery imagery, we've got the crumbling tower, we've got the figures falling away from the tower, and it's quite a harrowing scene there. So as we continue, I'll refer to the guidebook. Sorry about that odd cut there. But yeah, I will refer to the guidebook for the Jungian Tarot deck. And I'll just go ahead and read from the description of the tower. So the tower in this deck, the astrological association is Mars, and that tends to be the astrological association across decks, I think. And in this deck, Tower represents the archetype of Father as protector and avenger. It can signify quarreling, destruction, antagonism, upheaval, revenge, powerful energy applied suddenly, aggression, offensive power, great courage, and rules enforcement and strength, instruments of war and military leadership, or significant danger. We can take this moment here to take in the imagery of the card. And as you're studying a tarot card, any card in particular, um, it's good to again know the interpretation of the card, as that's fundamental to understanding the card. But you also want to allow yourself to interact with the card intuitively. So it really helps to study the imagery of the card. I mean, of course, you do that anyway, but maybe irrespective of the interpretation, studying the card's images, independent of the interpretation, rather, that might get your imagination going, just kind of getting you to develop an intuitive understanding of the card. Maybe want to look at, focus in on what sticks out to you the most. Of course, there's the fiery image, the fiery sword, which is different from, say, a lightning strike that you'd maybe see in other tarot decks, including the Rider-Waite-Smith, the most notable, most popular deck. So we've got our fire, and we've got our fiery sword. And there's so much other imagery going on in the background that's worth taking note of. My eye is actually drawn to the water, the way that the water is presented. We have what looks like two bodies of water separated by the ground or separated by earth. To me, they kind of look like step stairs, but my eyes were drawn to the water as well. And of course, there's always the bodies falling from the tower, and there is the figure striking the tower that looks like a human figure. And that I found to be pretty unique to this particular deck of cards. And maybe that sort of imagery shows up in other decks also. I've never seen them. But I find this to be a really striking image. So what could be the reason that the artist, Robert Wang, has used a male figure wielding a sword to take down the castle instead of, say, lightning, which is pretty common among other decks? You can also take a look at the sky. The sky looks very ominous. It almost looks like a vortex to me. A big celestial happenstance going on behind the scenes, or rather in the background. And of course, there's the bodies, notable. One thing that always stuck out to me when looking at tower cards from other decks is just kind of looking at the scale of the size of the people falling away from the tower versus the size of the tower itself. To me, in the Rider Waite Smith, for example, the proportion of the tower alongside the people falling, it almost looks like the people falling are rather tower sized, pretty large compared to the tower, which I always found curious. In this case, I would say maybe the images are a bit more proportional. The falling images. That's just kind of my opinion. Versus the size of the male figure, the male figure is actually as big as the tower itself, which I find to be very fascinating. So take a few moments, I guess, to interface with the card. Normally, at this point, I give myself maybe 5 minutes to meditate on the card before I do an imaginary interaction with the card. I refer to that as trying to create an inner landscape where I'm interacting with some element of the card, maybe imagining myself being within the card, and just kind of seeing what comes. Um, having an experience with the card that is relatable, that's maybe really just sort of engaging, and just kind of, for me anyway, is an interesting way to understand the card. And there's also, you're more than welcome to mute me as I'm talking if it would be, if it would make you feel, more in tune with the card. If my voiceover is distracting, don't hesitate to mute. So, again, I'll allow myself about 5 minutes to interact with the card. Hone in on the images that stuck out to me the most and see what they maybe say about the tower. Okay, so after 5 minutes have passed, I'll go ahead and set a timer for about 15 minutes. Usually I want my interactions to be 15 minutes long, no longer than 20 minutes. And we've got that going now. And I like to just kind of sit in the dark. And we have our cutaway here. And I have a few notes based on the source material, based on the companion books of this deck. And I just kind of wanted to read. I guess I have kind of a script. I don't necessarily want to go all over the place. Um, and maybe you'll find some insightful nuggets in this voiceover here. Now, just kind of looking, my initial observations drew me to the tower made of a man, apparently. I was drawn to his disproportionate, or rather his dispassionate expression and the businesslike approach to taking down the tower. You might notice that well, of course, you've noticed that it's a fiery sword, not a lightning strike like in the Rider Waite Smith deck and other decks. On this deck, the sword wielder represents the father archetype, father as protector and avenger. And if you've been following along with these studies, you'll know that the major arcana follow kind of a familial archetype where each of the arcana cards represent either the mother, father, son, or daughter archetype. And in this case, we have the father. Again, the father as protector and avenger. In this deck, the father is a figure of war, like a warring father who's also the emperor. There's a parallel between this card, this warring father, and the emperor father, which I find really interesting. Now, let's see, we have the warring father, who's the emperor out of his royal garb, and he's down from his throne. Now, he's armored and suited up as he sweeps away outdated and useless institutions. He reconciles this act of destruction with a rose of peace. Now, I hope it's not too hard to see on here, but in one hand he has a rose, while in the other hand, of course, he has his fiery sword. And that sword represents reconciliation. And perhaps in keeping with the father archetype, he represents the parental figure who has to make a tough love approach, to light a fire under their child or to impose consequences for a action or a choice that their child has made. So that's represented in a way in this particular card. Now, when we focus on the tower being destroyed, it makes me think of Robert Wang's inspiration for the tower, which draws on archetypal towers of Judeo Christian tradition. Now, there are two towers to start with in the Book of Enoch. I've downloaded that on my Kindle. I haven't read it yet, but based on what I've learned about how it's archetype, how the towers are represented in this tower, I'm very curious to read that. But anyway, there are two towers in the Book of Enoch that are relevant to Wang's vision here. Now, the first tower in the Book of Enoch is the true tower of God, and the other tower, it's a false tower, and it's built by man. It's akin to the Tower of Babel. It's a Babel type figure, which I find interesting. But this card also draws on another popular second century Christian text called The Shepherd of Hermas. I hope I'm saying that right. And based on that text, um, we have a great tower of square stones built upon the waters by 6 young men. Now, just that description alone, if we look at the towers that's made of squares and we draw on, the water in the background, I could see where the artist would draw from that particular text as inspiration for this card. Now, the white stones of the tower, according to the text, represent the quote, apostles, bishops, teachers, deacons, end quote, while the imagery of the falling bodies represents, quote, the sons of iniquity, who believe in hypocrisy and wickedness and did not part from it, which I think is an interesting explanation as to maybe why the tower is being destroyed, or one sort of traditional interpretation of a tower that would need to be destroyed. Now, returning to the Book of Enoch and the two towers, it's worth noting that one of the towers is referred to as the house of God, which is in fact the false tower made by presumptuous builders, and they're striving to build an edifice to rival the true tower of God. Now, this for me has an immediate association with the classical Marseille tarot deck and its version of the tower, or La Maison Dieu. Hope I said that right. Still learning my French. Which I found really interesting. So ultimately, the hubris and I dare say the blasphemy of the false house of God is punished with violent, sudden collapse by lightning, which I can see that in this card too, but it made me think of the Marseille tarot deck, which is actually named Maison Dieu. Dieu. Anyway, the other archetypal Judeo Christian tower is the Tower of Babel, of course, and that's erected in a similar conceit, but notably, instead of being physically destroyed by God, destroyed by lightning or fire, it's halted before its completion by the supernatural confusion of language among the builders. If you're familiar with the Tower of Babel and that story, um, the Lord struck the builders with confusion by creating multiple languages that hampered their speech to the point where they couldn't even complete the tower, which I think it's an interesting distinction, the Tower of Babel versus the towers represented in the Book of Enoch. Now, one of the other most striking elements of this card is the use of a fiery sword instead of lightning as an agent of destruction. The sword is made of, quote, divine fire for the sake of restoration after destruction. So it has the power to destroy, but that destruction will open the door for reconstruction. Let's see, back to my note here. Now, this card also represents a classicism, a classic sort of influence informed by paternal deities or fathers of gods, namely figures like Zeus, the weather god who protects and corrects to the point of destruction with his lightning bolt. Now, there are other classical gods, including Jupiter of the Roman pantheon. There's Woden, Teutonic god of thunder, master of woad or fury. Now, there's a responsibility that the sky gods were deemed to have over their creation. It was their duty to protect their children, but also to carry out destruction for the sake of restoration. And that's a prevailing interpretation of the Tower card from deck to deck. It's a destruction that precedes a renewal that's necessary. Now, the Tower itself is a largely allegorical figure that depicts the reality of violent conflict. Perpetual war making, for example, often engaged in by medieval emperors or princes. The tower is a representation of the impermanence of all man made structures. The things that we create of our own imagination, of our own daring, of our own sense of self worth, and our own striving. Ultimately, what goes up must come down in a lot of ways. Now, there's also the association with the fall of wayward institutions, corrupt or unfit societies, and the sacrifice of individual ego to a higher principle. I think this idea can also apply to, say, falling empires, things that are full of conceit or corruption or institutions that fail. They ultimately come down. Um, One thing that I've noticed in a lot of interpretations of this card, the tower has a sort of sudden, terrible impact that genuinely, or generally rather, seems sudden. But to me, it always seems like there are tiny signs along the way. They might be imperceptible. You might not necessarily know that there are changes that you need to make before you have a big tower moment. To me, it's come to represent maybe a failure of the imagination. Things that could have corrected or prevented a tower moment that were either unnoticed or not dealt with, and they culminate into the sorts of things that bring down the tower, which it feels sudden, but sometimes I feel like in hindsight, you know, there were signs, even if they were very small, very easy to miss, or rather innocuous. So that's kind of my little 2 cents on the way I tend to interpret the tower cards in general. It's a very interesting card. Now, the tower itself can also be a figure as a behavioral archetype of disaster and destruction itself. So the tower could just represent just the sorts of behaviors that lead to destruction. Kind of, again, just sort of when you think about the Judeo Christian archetypes of the towers, namely Babel, human conceit that causes us to build these towers. And maybe these towers are related to ego, and ultimately they come down. Also, according to my source notes, my source material, Jung addresses the immense powers of destruction that are granted to mankind, along with the need for healing intervention of the divine in order to help mankind resist destruction for its own sake, which I find to be fascinating as well. I mean, you think of all sorts of ways in which human beings can be destructive, whether it's to ourselves, to each other, or on a grander scale to our environment. Um, the idea of the environment itself isn't a tower because it's natural and it will more than likely, it will be here well after we're not here. But, you think about the ways in which humanity can be destructive to itself and to each other. And, sometimes a tower moment represents, kind of the culmination of destructive tendencies. Eventually, things have to come down. But one thing that's also really important to remember about the tower card is that the tower, again, tends to stand for a terrible misfortune, which tends to happen suddenly and generally without warning, technically. But ultimately, it comes before a much needed renewal. Now, when you think about standard tarot, you think about the position of the tower card, that the tower tends to be followed by the star card, which is a card of inspiration, a card of renewal. Now, in this particular study, um, as you may have noticed if you're following this deck study, that the I'm losing my words. I am a little bit off script here. I guess that's why. These cards aren't necessarily going in the order of the Fool's Journey. For this particular deck, or rather this particular study, and I'm following along with the examples set by the Tarot Psychology book, one of my source books. is that we're not necessarily following the fool's journey as the major arcana cards are laid out in, you know, standard tarot. But I think the order in which, you know, this particular study goes and the order in which I'm getting to know the cards, it might be more in line with maybe the groupings of the certain archetypes. Maybe they're grouped father, mother, son, daughter, even though from what I've seen over the past few weeks, that's not necessarily the case either. So I guess technically, I'm not quite sure of the rationale for the way in which the cards should be studied, but I am going by the tarot psychology book. And so far, it's really helped me to understand this particular deck. And I hope that even if you're not working with this specific deck, that maybe these videos are giving you an insight into the archetypes of these major arcana cards anyway. Or at the very least, they're helping guide you in your own tarot study practice. I would say any deck that you have, you can take it out, really find time if you can to interact with each card on its own level. I'm doing one of these cards once a week, and I'm having maybe two interactions, two kind of 15-minute sort of interactions with the cards, um, twice a week, no more than 20 minutes. You know, I find that to be a rather meditative, enjoyable process. And I hope that if you've been watching and following along the series, thank you so much if you have been. But hopefully, you'll come away with an understanding of the particular archetype that we're studying. If you happen to have this deck of tarot cards, hopefully this has kind of been of use to you as we're going through the deck. And if this makes this particular deck an interesting deck for you, I think that's a good thing. This is actually a very interesting deck. Um, I might have mentioned in some of my other videos that this was the first deck that I bought, based on an interest in tarot informed by Jungian psychology. But I'm not sure that this would be the first deck that you want, unless you're very specifically interested in Jung's take on tarot or his use of the tarot archetypes in his practice, in his work. But anyway, I think we're coming to the end of our 15 minutes interaction with the card. Yep, there we go. Yeah, and I really hope that you have enjoyed this video, that you've gotten something out of it that's helped you study these cards. And again, are the source materials. And yeah, for our Jungian tarot deck. And I've enjoyed this time that we've had together, and I hope you have as well. And until I see you again, have a great week and talk to you soon.